The situation for France was turning against itself. The campaign in Germany was a disaster. Flanders came under threat of invasion. Spain was okay, but not good. The same could be said for Italy. Okay, but not good. After the Battle of Blenheim, it could only get worse. As for Amadeus, though, his forces were on the verge of destruction. That year, Nice and Villefranche fell to a land and sea assault. Casale had fallen, so had Aosta, Pinerolo, and Asti, all falling to the Bourbons. Only Asti held after a surprise attack conducted to retake it, caused further annoyance to the French army. Berua was the only major stronghold left. Montmelion fell after being besieged for nearly 2 years, since the invasion began in 1704. Berua and its garrison was the only thing keeping Turin from coming under. The Piedmontese fortress ring was nearly destroyed. But there was hope for Amadeus. Prince Eugen was well on his way to return to Italy after the German campaign. This caused much fear amongst the French high command. Eugen was no joke, and the Bourbons knew that. Already the imperial forces had moved onto the far east of the Padana plain, already threatening the Franco-Spanish defenses around Lombardy and Milan. Vendôme sent his brother, Philip de Vendôme, to hold the imperial army at bay while he attended to things in Piedmont. Believing Eugen was headed for Mantua, Philip was caught off guard at the city of Cassano. Holding the passage of the Adda River, Eugen wished to cross. Realizing the true intentions of Eugen, Vendôme hurriedly gathered 2,000 men with cavalry to aid his brother. Vendôme found his brother's forces in complete disarray, with the baggage train blocking the Adda River's main bridge. He ordered the baggage train thrown into the water and reorganized the army to counter a great assault by the imperial army. After failing to attack the bridge with Austrian grenadiers, Eugen ordered his Prussian battalions to assault the French left, which were met with heavy volleys and cannon fire, leaving around 600 Prussians dead. The battle surged back and forth for many hours. Eugen was wounded twice and forced to leave the field. Vendôme had his horse shot from underneath him. The battle was inconclusive. The French held their ground, but the Imperials delayed the siege of Turin for a while longer. The French lost around 5,000 men killed or wounded. Eugen lost nearly the same amount. Both sides were forced into winter quarters. Beforehand in the west, Berua came under siege in January. The city's garrison held until the 9th of April, a day longer than expected by its garrison. Whilst Vendôme thought it would fall by the 15th of January months earlier, the people in the city fired empty shells into other Piedmontese camps to keep in communication with Turin. The lack of food and ammunitions eventually took its toll. After a long and bloody siege, worse than that of Vercelli, with around 7,000 Piedmontese and Austrian killed, 12,000 French killed, a costly success for Vendôme, the city finally fell. Around this time, the Battle of Cassano had occurred. The campaign would move into 1706. The road to Turin is now open, and La Feuillade would begin the siege. The city of Turin was incredibly fortified. It contained 46,000 inhabitants, 21 bastions, 2 at the citadel, 226 cannon, 28 mortars, 370 metric tons of gunpowder, and 5 months' worth of stocked food. Marshal Vauban, Louis XIV's greatest engineer, knew the siege would require attacks from all sides before the city could be taken, and at least 3 months of complicated action. Earlier that year, Vendôme won a significant victory at the Battle of Calcinato on the 19th of April. Vendôme surprised and defeated the Danish general, the Count of Reventlow, only losing around 500 men against the 10,000 Imperials. This was all while Eugen was gathering an army to relieve Turin and set the Imperials back for a while. On the 2nd of June, the siege works began. Already La Feuillade ran into issues. He had around 10,000 men short of what Vauban proposed, and had not enough to encircle the city completely. The other 48,000 troops were required to protect Milan and halt Eugen's advance. La Feuillade intended to repeat the siege of Verua, ignoring how heavy those casualties had been, at over 12,000 men lost. Artillery bombardment began from both sides. The Piedmontese artilleryman, Count della Margherita, concentrated all of his cannon on specific targets, an unusual but effective tactic of the time, which would become later known as the concentration principle. Count de Caraglio, the city governor, and Count Daun were placed in command of the defense. These men conducted the defense of Turin in such a way that would cause much despair among the French besiegers. Casualties were already growing high, and disease set in. The French answered by intensifying the bombardment to 8,000 shells fired a day, whilst the Piedmontese fired barely 3,000. Amadeus himself exploited the gap in the French lines, left with 4,000 cavalry earlier before he could be caught in order to join Eugen if he came. He was spotted, however, and Lafayette dispatched 10,000 men to capture him. The Duke managed to elude them. In good news for the Duke, Marshal Vendôme was dispatched to the region of Flanders, after news of the defeat at the Battle of Ramillies. Now command of the French army eastward was given to the inexperienced Philip II, Duke of Orleans, with Marshal Marsin as his advisor. Now the Bourbon trenches started to come closer to the San Maurizio and Beato Amadeo bastion. The French and Spanish assaulted and managed to capture them. The Piedmontese sent the Guard, Piemonte, and Saluzzo regiments to recapture them. Unfortunately, the Franco-Spanish troops were in the middle of changing the Guard, meaning there were twice as many there as usual. After some fierce fighting, the Piedmontese fell back, with 300 killed and 33 taken prisoner. The French launched a new assault on the covered road surrounded by the same bastion. The Piedmontese guards counterattacked and beat back the French, costing them only 80 men compared to the 300 French. Around the 8th of August, the French began burning the now empty countryside homes and villas surrounding Turin. This didn't discourage the defenders, but angered them to keep on fighting, burning more than 150 homes in 2 days. Italian soldier Solaro wrote, "Everybody sees this with his own eyes, the burning home belonging to him. It no longer waits to be notified by other people." The French infantry proved ineffective without good artillery support. The artillery couldn't damage the city walls effectively, as the walls were too high to bombard from a distance. By the 20th of August, the French finally brought forward a battery that could hit the only weak point in the walls. Piedmontese miners knew of this prior, dug under the battery, placing explosive beneath it. At 10 a.m. on the 24th of August, the battery vanished under a great explosion. Count Daun was dumbfounded and watched. On the 27th, French infantry stormed the counterguards in the crescent, killing all of the defenders. Yet the Piedmontese counterattacked with hundreds more grenadiers. The French were exhausted and caught off guard, causing them to rout. Purposely done, as the French generals were at church for the day of St. Louis, the Sun King's name day. Shortly afterwards, Daun ordered the debris and wood around Turin's walls to be set ablaze near a French ordnance house. Not only could the French not approach the walls here, but the ordnance house exploded, taking a few artillery batteries, clothes, gunpowder, munitions, and soldiers with it. Count Daun was delighted, gave the men who set the blaze large sums of money. The next night on the 29th of August, French underground attack failed, only thanks to a brave Piedmontese sapper, Pietro Mica, who set the explosives. With him went down a whole company of French grenadiers and other troops from pouring into a breach, one that could have led into the city. Pietro Mica is remembered as a national hero in Italy to this very day. But in other news, a 22,000 Bourbon reinforcement army from Lombardy arrived to aid the siege. For the defenders of Turin, this was worrying, but on the French side, they knew this army had to come to Turin because Prince Eugen was marching to relieve it. As for Victor Amadeus, he was still with his cavalry in the Wallonesian Valley. There he harassed French supply convoys, attacked small garrisons, and intercepted communications between the Bourbons. This made communication very unclear for the besiegers of Turin. Amadeus was losing men the more he committed them. Of the 4,000 dragoons he had taken with him when the siege began, he was now down to 2,400. This is all he could manage until Prince Eugen arrived, and he was coming. As the Duke of Orleans reached Milan to begin his hunt for the prince, Eugen feigned 2 fake and 1 real attacks in the area of Verona towards Lombardy. He immediately left as the Orleans approached, quickly marching his men through Modena and Parma, whilst the inexperienced Orleans expected him at Guastalla. Now Eugen only had a few small Franco-Spanish garrisons in front of him. These were not the real struggle. His men's hunger and desire for pay were. But no matter how bread or coin-starved Eugen's men were for the moment, he knew how to keep them going. His army covered around 30.5 miles every 4 days. If Turin fell, Italy would follow suit, allowing the French to pour their troops into Spain. Turin couldn't be lost. And now it was down to the dramatic final week of the siege. Suddenly, a large, desperate assault by the French on the main bastion began. Count Down immediately gathered any forces he could to fill the gap. The Piedmontese guards rushed forward, chanting, "Long live Savoy!" The French replied with, "Long live the King!" After a 2-hour bloody clash, Down blew up an explosive mine underneath the French, and none survived. But on the 6th of September, Count Down saw a very relieving sight. Campfires beyond the hills of Turin. Eugene's army had arrived, and tomorrow the attack will begin. The morning of September 7th, 1706. Not a single bugle or drum were sounded. Imperial infantry and grenadiers marched to the French positions. With no doubt, the French were awakened with great surprise. In total confusion, messages were desperately sent for Lafayette to attempt to bring reinforcements. But it was too late, for Eugen had deployed his forces. Leading the Imperial left was the Prince of Anhalt-Dessau, leading his Prussians. Center by the Duke of Württemberg, Königsegg von Rothenfels. The right is led by Frederick I of Saxe-Gotha. The French were led by the Duke of Orléans, the Comte d'Estaing leading his right, and Marshal Marsin leading his left. Orléans' men were outnumbered, but worst of all, exhausted, ridden with disease from a long siege. The rest of the Franco-Spanish forces were still in their trenches around the city walls. The French were in a dangerous position. If Amadeus was on the other side of the Stour River, as they had feared, there would be no good route to retreat on. If they were routed here, it would mean the destruction of the Bourbon army in Italy as a disaster. By 11 a.m., Eugen slightly gestured his hand, faintly spoke the word, "Advance." On the left, German grenadiers started their first attack, followed by Dessau's Prussian infantry. The drums rolled and the fifes and bugles finally sounded. French artillery was just barely out of range at first, but as the grenadiers came closer, volleys rang out. The grenadiers halted, fired a volley into the French ranks, fixed bayonets, charge. The exhausted French defenders amazingly repulsed this first attack. Prussian infantry was ordered to advance further to aid the grenadiers, opening a new attack with greater numbers and ferocity. More volleys rang out amongst the intense fighting. Meanwhile, Imperial Hussars reported to Amadeus on the other side of the Stour River. He marched to the sound of the guns with his infantry and cavalry that had remained. As he crossed, it became clear how dangerous the position was. The French, their worst fear had been realized. The arrival of Piedmontese troops would finally break the French right wing. D'Estaing and his troops were forced to withdraw, a hasty retreat. The Duke of Saxe-Gotha attacked the right, and Württemberg and Königsegg attacked the center to support Prince Dessau, with cavalry following close behind, beginning to enter through the intended gaps in the Allied line. French dragoons were nearing the Prussians. D'Estaing's cavalry attempted a charge in a last-ditch effort to save the right wing. The Prussians were saved by volleys from the Imperial battalions from the center. Eugen personally came up to the fortification line, bringing the Imperial cavalry from the center forward. His horse was shot under him as he came closer to the battlefield, but nonetheless, he took another horse and continued to lead at the front. As author Paoletti describes, untamed, muddy, and bloody. The combined strength of the Imperial and Piedmontese cavalry destroyed and routed their opposite. The remaining French infantry, if not destroyed by the Imperials, gathered around the small town of Madonna di Campagna, reinforced by some infantry and cavalry sent by Marshal Marsin. The other regiments retreated in chaos across all directions, some even towards Milan. The French left began to break as well. The French relied on the defense of the Lucento castle. The Orléans and Marshal Marsin were present. Reinforced by 3,000 dragoons sent by Lafayette, the Orléans had taken 3 musket balls in his army, and was also shot once in the hip. Marsin was fatally wounded. The intense fire, movement of troops around the field, and battle cries and screams of the dying made it impossible to. De Orleans was shot again in the arm, forcing him to leave the field this time. The French army defending against Prince Eugen had no commander immediately present. The French soldiers themselves held as long as they could and fought ferociously, but the line finally snapped. The Allied cavalry would finish off or force the retreat of troops surrounding Turin. The disastrous defeat at the Battle of Turin cost the French over 20,000 men, 10,000 of which died in this. This was 21% of La Feuad's army, along with countless guns, ammunition, and supplies. Allies in comparison lost only around 3,500 in this, and another 3,000 in the battle. The battle's consequences stretched farther than that of casualties, as all Spanish territories in Italy would fall to Austrians. Lombardy, Naples, Sicily, and eventually Sardinia, although these conquests would occur gradually, not immediately. When the Duke of Marlborough received news of Eugen and Amadeus' victory, he proclaimed, "I love that little prince." Turin had probably been the worst Bourbon defeat since the Battle of Blenheim in 1704. And now it allowed the Allies a way to invade southern France. Essentially, the war in Italy was over. But before moving on to 707, Marlborough would once again fight a great battle, this time the previously mentioned village of Ramillies.